The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, but on this day it felt more like a stage for power and pride. A soft-spoken woman, dressed simply and carrying no lawyer by her side, walked nervously into the room. Everyone thought she didn't stand a chance. Across from her sat people with expensive suits, polished arguments, and the confidence that comes from money and influence. The judge himself, known for siding with the powerful, looked at her with impatience. He believed this case would be quick, that this ordinary woman would falter under pressure. What he didn't know was that beneath her quiet demeanor was a mind sharper than anyone could imagine. As whispers filled the room, people wondered why she hadn't hired an attorney. Some pitied her, others mocked her, convinced that this was a hopeless fight. The judge leaned forward, ready to intimidate, ready to rush her into mistakes. But as she stood there, holding her papers with steady hands, her eyes carried a calm fire. She wasn't just here to defend herself. She was about to turn the tables on a system that thought it could crush her. This wasn't just a battle about legal terms or paperwork. It was about dignity, truth, and courage against corruption. Each word she spoke would reveal something deeper. Each question she asked would strike where no one expected. The courtroom, once against her, would soon start to shift in silence. But at this moment, no one knew the truth. This so-called simple woman was about to outsmart them all. The judge smirked, thinking he had control. But he was about to discover that he wasn't facing an ordinary citizen. He was facing a hidden legal prodigy. And the first blow was about to land. The woman's name was Clara, and most in town only knew her as a quiet neighbor who minded her own business. She worked long hours at a small shop, lived simply, and never caused trouble. That was why people were shocked to see her standing alone in front of the judge. How could someone like her possibly go up against a courtroom filled with lawyers, paperwork, and hidden deals? What no one realized was that Clara had spent years studying the law in her own time, not in a university or behind ivy-covered walls, but late at night with borrowed books and free resources. It was her way of surviving, her way of protecting herself in a world that often ignored people like her. The judge, however, didn't care about her story. He had made up his mind before the hearing even began. In his view, Clara was just another ordinary woman, too naive to understand what she was up against. He planned to rush through the case, push her into confusion, and move on without a second thought. His reputation for siding with the wealthy had already left many families broken, but no one had dared to challenge him. Clara's opponents were confident too. Their attorneys were skilled, used to winning with polished speeches and technical jargon. They barely looked at Clara, certain she would crumble under the weight of legal terms she couldn't possibly know. Yet, as she stood in silence, listening carefully, she was already noticing small cracks in their arguments, mistakes they didn't expect anyone to catch. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, every glance filled with doubt. To most, this seemed like a hopeless fight. But beneath the surface, something far more powerful was building. And soon, the first sign of Clara's hidden brilliance would appear. The first witness was called, and the opposing attorney wasted no time painting Clara as careless and unprepared. He spoke with confidence, throwing around complicated terms as if to remind everyone that Clara didn't belong in this arena. The judge nodded along, already leaning in their favor. But Clara sat quietly, her eyes focused, her notes carefully marked. She wasn't intimidated. She was studying every word. What the courtroom didn't know was that Clara had seen this kind of performance before. She had spent years helping neighbors with small disputes, learning how people in power often twisted the truth. She had watched hearings where details were brushed aside, where the weak were silenced. Every time, she promised herself that if her turn ever came, she would be ready. And now, here she was, facing the very system she had once feared. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread. Some thought Clara had made a mistake by representing herself, while others admired her courage. Her closest friend, Maria, sat in the back row, watching with both worry and pride. Maria knew Clara's strength better than anyone. She had seen her spend nights with stacks of books, memorizing laws most people couldn't even pronounce. She also knew Clara carried a personal wound, something that fueled her determination. Years ago, Clara's own family had been wronged in a similar courtroom with the same judge presiding. Meanwhile, the judge tapped his gavel impatiently, growing restless with her silence. He expected her to stumble, to beg for mercy, or to ask for more time. But Clara was waiting for the right moment. Each passing second made the tension sharper. Each exchange between lawyer and witness set the stage. The conflict was no longer just about the case. It was about exposing the truth buried under power. And Clara was preparing to strike. The turning point began when Clara finally rose from her seat. The room grew quiet, as though no one expected her to actually challenge what had been said. She walked slowly to the center, papers in hand, her voice steady but clear. "I have a few questions," she said, and the courtroom shifted. Even the attorneys, who had been so sure of themselves, glanced at one another. The judge raised an eyebrow, still confident she would embarrass herself, but willing to let her speak if only to speed her downfall. Clara started simply asking about dates, numbers, and small details the witness had just given. At first, the answers came easily, but then her tone sharpened. She began pointing out contradictions, lines that didn't match, timelines that overlapped. The polished lawyer tried to interrupt, but Clara pressed on, her words crisp, her knowledge undeniable. Each question cut deeper, unraveling the neat picture that had been painted against her. The audience leaned forward, whispering as they began to notice what was happening. Maria's heart raced in the back row, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. She had seen Clara prepare for years, but watching her stand here, calmly dismantling the arguments of seasoned lawyers, was something no one could have predicted. The judge's smirk faded slightly. His gavel tapped again, more out of nerves than control. He had expected an easy case, but now, before his eyes, the balance of power was shifting. Clara wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing cracks in a system built to silence people like her. Every word she spoke drew the room tighter, like a rope pulling on both sides. The tension was almost unbearable. Everyone knew the next few moments could decide everything, but no one could yet see where Clara's brilliance would land its heaviest blow. Just as the tension in the room reached its peak, Clara paused, her eyes fixed on a single document that had been submitted as evidence. She held it up slowly, her voice calm but sharp. "This file," she said, "doesn't belong here." The room stirred with confusion. The opposing lawyer quickly stood, insisting it was valid, but Clara didn't back down. She pointed out details so small most people would have missed them: an incorrect stamp, a signature that didn't match, a date that made no sense. The murmurs grew louder as people realized what she was implying. Someone had tampered with the evidence. The judge stiffened, his face tightening. This was no longer a simple matter of arguments and counterarguments. If Clara was right, it meant corruption wasn't just present in the system, it was sitting in the very case unfolding before them. The lawyers tried to dismiss her claims as coincidence, but Clara calmly laid out fact after fact, building a chain no one could ignore. Every piece connected, and with each word, the stakes grew heavier. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She knew Clara had prepared, but this revelation was something even she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about defending herself anymore. Clara was now threatening to expose a hidden network of lies that reached higher than anyone in the courtroom had imagined. The opposing attorney grew visibly uneasy, his voice breaking as he tried to regain control. The judge, who once leaned on arrogance, now seemed cornered between his usual habits and the undeniable truth rising before him. The audience could feel it. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a battle against something larger, something dangerous. And with each passing second, Clara's fight was pushing closer to the breaking point, where everything would be forced into the open. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Clara laid the questionable document on the table. The judge leaned forward, his composure cracking, while the opposing lawyer scrambled to explain. Clara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm certainty carried more weight than any performance. With steady hands, she revealed a second copy of the same file, one she had quietly obtained through public records. The differences were undeniable. The original had been altered. Gasps rippled through the audience. The lawyer stammered, sweat beading on his forehead, and the judge's gavel struck hard against the desk. But the sound no longer carried authority. It sounded like desperation. Clara pressed on, exposing how the false evidence had been slipped into the case to sway the outcome. She connected the dots so clearly that even those with no legal background could see the truth. The room shifted. For the first time, the power didn't belong to the judge or the wealthy attorneys. It belonged to the woman they had underestimated. The judge, cornered by the evidence, had no choice but to acknowledge her findings. The case that was meant to silence Clara had now unraveled in front of everyone, leaving the opposing side with nothing to stand on. But just when it seemed like Clara had won, the final twist came. As the judge prepared to dismiss the case, Clara looked him directly in the eye and revealed one last fact. The same handwriting that appeared on the altered document matched handwriting from files signed in his own office. The room erupted in shock. What started as a simple defense had now exposed the judge himself. The climax hit like thunder. Clara had not only defended her name, she had pulled the mask off the very man who thought he could crush her. And the whole courtroom would never forget it. The courtroom was never the same after that moment. The judge, once so confident in his control, sat frozen in silence as the weight of Clara's words settled over the room. For years, people had whispered about his favoritism, but no one had ever dared to challenge him. Now the truth had been dragged into the light, not by a seasoned attorney, but by the very woman he had dismissed as powerless. The attorneys who had stood so tall just hours earlier lowered their heads, knowing their case had collapsed beyond repair. Clara gathered her papers calmly, her voice steady as she requested that the false evidence be stricken from the record. The judge had no choice but to comply. For the first time, his gavel echoed not as a symbol of dominance, but of defeat. The case against Clara was dismissed, and with it, the courtroom's air shifted from doubt to awe. Maria could barely hold back tears as she watched her friend walk out not as a victim, but as a victor. Outside the courthouse, people whispered Clara's name with respect. Some saw her as a symbol of courage, others as proof that knowledge could outshine wealth and power. Clara herself didn't bask in the victory. She only felt relief that justice, for once, had been served. Her years of quiet study, her nights of persistence, had finally meant something more than survival. The story of a simple woman defeating corruption traveled quickly, inspiring many who had once felt voiceless. Clara's courage showed that even in a flawed system, truth could still rise. She didn't just defend herself, she reminded everyone that resilience, knowledge, and determination are stronger than fear. And that lesson would live on long after the gavel's final strike.